It began like any other quiet night on the coast of Devon, England, in the summer of 1625. The moon hung in a precarious stillness, spilling a pale light across the cliffs and the restless sea below. Fishermen had long since pulled their boats ashore, and the tiny hamlet of Lightemar slept without fear. No one heard the sails, dark, triangular, foreign, cutting through the fog. No one smelled the oil lamps burning aboard the ships that drifted ever closer, silent as ghosts. When the bells finally clanged in the church tower, it was already too late. Shadows broke from the dunes. Doors shuddered under the weight of boots, and what had been a village became a slaughterhouse. The attackers were not mere thieves or restless sailors gone rogue. They were Barbary corsairs, pirates sanctioned by the regencies of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, under the watchful gaze of the Ottoman Empire. Behind their raids was more than greed, it was enterprise. A steady stream of human cargo that fed the markets from North Africa to Anatolia. They weren't hunting gold or silver, they were hunting souls. In the records of the time, their captives were counted like livestock. Among the hundreds taken that night was Clara Wren, a pastor's daughter, barely 20 years old. She had never set foot outside her county, never seen a Moor, never imagined that men from a continent she'd only heard about in church sermons would be the ones to drag her screaming into the darkness. By sunrise, Lightemar no longer existed. The smoke of burnt cottages rose into the gray dawn, mingling with seabirds and the cries of those left behind. The pirates forced the captives toward the shore, clamping chains around their wrists and necks, binding them together in lines that stretched into the waves. Those who resisted were cut down where they stood. The rest were packed into boats and ferried to the ships anchored beyond the reef. And as the last surviving villagers watched from the cliffs, the wind carried away the scent of burning wood and the sound of foreign voices singing prayers of triumph in a language no one in England understood. Clara was thrown into the hold of a corsair galley beside other women from her village. There was barely room to stand. The air was heavy with fear and sweat, fouled by sickness and the occasional crack of a whip above deck. For days the captives endured the groaning of wood and the endless rhythm of oars, slaves chained to their benches, their flesh rubbed raw, their eyes dull with exhaustion. Rats scuttled around their feet. Some women prayed, others sat in silence, unable to believe this was real. Within the suffocating darkness, Clara tried to keep her mind anchored to home, to her mother's hands kneading bread, to the bells of Sunday morning, to the hills that shimmered green under the sun. But memory was a painful thing when the sea surrounded you on all sides, and every sound reminded you that the world you knew was gone. The journey took weeks. The pirates avoided main trade routes, steering south toward Algiers. When they finally reached the harbor, Clara and the others were yanked into the glare of sunlight so bright it blinded them. The city rose white and gold behind the docks, bustling, alive, indifferent. Here, human lives were a commodity, auctioned in broad daylight. In the slave markets of the Barbary coast, beauty was currency, youth was profit, and despair was cheap. Clara was taken to the central square, where buyers gathered beneath the colonnades. Chains rattled, merchants shouted prices, the salty air stung of spices and sweat. One by one the women were cleaned, perfumed, and displayed. Their skin was poked, their teeth checked, their hair pulled. Buyers haggled not over their humanity, but over weight, complexion, and age. Clara stood trembling on the auction platform, her pale skin marking her instantly as exotic. The men in robes circled her, speaking fast, their eyes calculating. The auctioneer shouted numbers she couldn't understand, and with a strike of a mallet her identity was erased, sold to a man named Yusuf al-Karim, an affluent merchant from Tunis. She didn't know his name then, she only knew the terror in her veins when his hand gripped her shoulder and dragged her away. The journey to Tunis was another nightmare. The ship reeked of decay and human misery. Clara's wrists ached from the shackles that gnawed at them day and night. When storms hit, seawater poured through the cracks in the hull, drenching the captives. Some fell ill with fever. The weak were thrown overboard. The rest survived by clinging to the hope that something, anything, might spare them. In her delirium, Clara prayed not for freedom, but for the strength to keep breathing. When they finally reached Tunisia, the captives were divided again. Men separated from women, children torn from their mothers. Those who resisted were beaten until their screams stopped. Clara was taken to Yusuf's estate, a sprawling house surrounded by olive trees and high walls. The women there didn't speak her language, but their eyes told stories of lives consumed by servitude. They washed her with rosewater, dressed her in silks that stung her skin, and led her into a courtyard filled with the heavy scent of myrrh. When Yusuf entered, adorned in gold, Clara realized he wasn't just her master. He was her fate. The archives of the period describe what awaited women like her with quiet precision. The young and beautiful were rarely left to heavy labor. They were groomed, instructed, subdued, trained to serve in the harems of powerful men. In those hidden walls, stripped of identity, language, and hope, European women became curiosities. Their hair, their eyes, their strangeness fetched higher prices. Some were renamed, converted, erased. They learned to smile when commanded, to dance when bidden, to speak only when permitted. Beneath the surface of silk and perfume, fear lived in every heartbeat. There is a story, often whispered, rarely written, of a Venetian girl named Isabella Contarini, taken at sea in 1575. She survived years in captivity in Algiers before being purchased by a nobleman for his private collection of concubines. In her journal, found decades later in a monastery, she described how every evening the women were lined up and evaluated like art pieces. "We became less than human," she wrote, "for even our suffering was measured by their satisfaction." That same cycle of cruelty repeated itself for centuries, swallowing thousands of women from Ireland, France, Spain, and Italy. Each story was different, yet dreadfully the same. In Yusuf's house, Clara learned silence. She who once sang hymns now whispered prayers into the darkness, not knowing if God could hear her in this distant land. Every morning she scrubbed marble floors. Every night she waited for the sound of footsteps outside her door. Days blurred into weeks, then months, each indistinguishable from the last. The only time she saw the sky was in the small courtyard where she hung the laundry. Even then the gate guards watched her like a trapped bird, lest she flew away. Escape was a dream too dangerous to think about, yet amidst the horror, Clara began to notice something unsettling. Occasionally, women vanished from the household. One day they were there, the next day gone, sold, traded, dead. New faces replaced them, fresh captives with the same hollow eyes. The trade was endless, fed by wars, storms, and greed. For every ship that returned home, 3 more were lost. Between 1530 and 1780, over 1 million Europeans fell into the slave markets of North Africa. Entire coastlines were abandoned, villages ceased to exist. To live near the sea was to live with dread. And still, Europe forgot. When diplomats spoke of pirates, they framed them as nuisances, not as architects of terror. Nations too busy feuding among themselves turned a blind eye, and entire generations of families vanished into history's silence. The stories of these women became ghost whispers carried on the tides, unspoken, buried, erased. But tonight their voices rise again, carried across the centuries. Clara, Isabella, Joan, and countless others, names that no one prayed for anymore. As you listen to this tale, remember that history is not just written by victors, but by survivors. If their voices are heard, don't let their stories be erased again. If you want to uncover the parts of history the world tried to bury, subscribe now, because the next chapter will reveal what truly happened inside those walls, the unimaginable horrors and small acts of defiance that history tried to forget. The air inside Yusuf al-Karim's estate was heavy with silence. Every sound, the trickle of water through the marble fountain, the rustle of silk slippers in the corridor, seemed to echo louder than it should. Day after day drifted through routine, morning prayers muttered in languages Clara still couldn't understand, afternoons spent cleaning tiled halls glimmering with turquoise and jade, and long, bone-deep hours of waiting. The walls were so high that the outside world felt unreal, like a dream she once had as a child of running in meadows that no longer existed. Here, there was no sunset, no horizon, only ceilings painted with stars, only the faint scent of spices and incense drowning out the truth that this place was a prison built from beauty. Slavery under the Barbary regencies was an economy of human misery polished to efficiency. By the mid-1600s, more than half of the urban populations of Algiers and Tunis contained slaves, European men chained to oars or masonry work, European women behind veils and locked doors. Yet the fate of a woman like Clara wasn't decided merely by her captor's wealth. It was shaped by her silence, her compliance, her ability to disappear into obedience. The women in Yusuf's estate spoke many tongues, Italian, Spanish, Greek, but shared the same broken language of glances. The older ones guided the new arrivals without words, instructing them when to lower their gaze, when to step aside, when not to breathe too loud. Clara learned quickly. Survival required obedience, but also cunning. The cooks pitied her and would sneak pieces of bread and dried figs between meals. A Greek woman called Agathe, once a merchant's daughter from Crete, taught her the simplest Arabic phrases and a secret truth. Even here, even within these gleaming tombs, there were ways to resist, small ones, invisible to men. Whispered songs in their own languages at night, a mark scratched beneath a courtyard tile, a name hidden behind the folds of a curtain. Tiny rebellions against oblivion. But rebellion was dangerous. Yusuf's steward Hassan acted as both warden and executioner. He grew fat off the misery of the enslaved. A single whisper of defiance brought punishment. The courtyard had a place called the White Circle, where those caught trying to escape were tied overnight beneath the open sky. By dawn, the desert flies had already feasted. Clara saw this once. A young woman named Leonie from Marseille, who had tried to run toward the docks. She did not survive the morning. After that day, Clara stopped dreaming of the sea. What made the system particularly cruel was its legality. Under Ottoman law, Christian captives were property, agricultural tools with a heartbeat. Their masters had absolute power, the right to sell, to trade, to punish, and to possess. Conversion to Islam, however, complicated things. It didn't set them free, it merely shifted their chains. If a woman converted willingly or under pressure, she was no longer a slave of foreign faith, but of circumstance. And for many, that conversion became an act of self-preservation. Clara resisted for months, clinging to the memory of her faith whispered in her own tongue. But the beatings, the endless hunger, the despair, they broke her voice long before they broke her spirit. One evening, under the flickering shadows of oil lamps, she uttered the Islamic declaration of faith. The words burned her throat, but they bought her breath, food, and temporary mercy. After her conversion, Yusuf granted her a new name, Layla, meaning night. To him it was poetic, to her it was annihilation. Names were memory, and without hers she felt her identity fade piece by piece. She was no longer Clara Wren of Devon, she was Layla of nothing. Still, Layla, the shadow of Clara, learned to walk quietly, to smile without meaning, to speak softly when spoken to, and through that forced adaptation she survived. Within the walls of Yusuf's home, stories circulated like whispers on wind. Some women had been there decades, others appeared and vanished in weeks. It was said that the wealthiest masters kept their harems not merely for pleasure but as instruments of power. To own foreign women, especially Europeans, was a mark of prestige among the Ottoman elite. Their pale skin and blue eyes symbolized status. They were objects to display, not people to cherish. Some masters commissioned portraits of their slaves, presenting them like trophies of conquest. European travelers who glimpsed these portraits decades later wrote of them as romantic muses, ignorant of the chains hidden behind paint and silk. For every Clara, there were thousands whose names history never recorded. Some became mothers to children who would never know their true ancestry. Some died before their faces had time to age. Others adapted so completely that when freedom finally arrived, through ransom, escape, or political upheaval, they had no home left to return to, no language that still felt like their own. These were not isolated sorrows, but the fabric of an entire era stretched between continents. Clara's story might have ended as just another statistic lost to time, if not for what happened in the spring of 1628. Ships carrying Algerian corsairs were intercepted near Sardinia by a Dutch vessel under Admiral Jacob van Heemskerk. On board were European captives, sailors, boys, and several women, whose pale skin and blonde hair betrayed their origins. They were freed, ransomed, and taken to Livorno. The few who spoke of their years in North Africa described horrors that Europe dismissed as exaggerations. They spoke of Christian women paraded naked in markets, of men sent to die chained to ship oars, of children taken so young they forgot their families' faces. For the first time, governments began to take notice, though not out of compassion, but out of fear that such raids would reach their own shores. Meanwhile, in Tunis, Yusuf al-Karim's influence waned. Trade routes shifted, rival factions rose. Desperate to maintain wealth, he liquidated part of his household, including slaves, through sale to other merchants. It was during that turbulent year that Layla, once known as Clara, was sold again. Her second owner was an Ottoman official, Mahmud Bey, a man of immense rank and darker appetites. By then, Clara had learned the truth of this system. Beauty was both weapon and curse. To refuse him was to invite pain. To obey was to surrender the last fragment of herself. Mahmud Bey's palace was far larger, its halls richly draped and guarded. The harem he maintained was like a small city within walls. Hundreds of women sorted by age, language, and origin, all under the watch of eunuchs and older concubines promoted to positions of control. Within this hierarchy, cruelty took on quieter forms: humiliation, isolation, competition. Women were encouraged to despise one another, to steal favor with smiles born from fear. Yet amid that degradation, friendships still formed, fragile, fleeting, precious. In long nights under candlelight, the captives would whisper about their homes, rivers of France, the mist over Irish cliffs, the snowfields of Poland. They built memories together, weaving a tapestry of loss. Years passed. Clara, now older, understood what survival cost. She watched new captives arrive, young girls terrified just as she had been. She tried to comfort them, teaching them how to avoid punishment, how to exist in smaller movements. Among them was a fiery Spanish maid named Inés, who refused to bow her head. Her defiance reignited something within Clara, an ember of strength long buried. Through Inés she remembered her own name. The sound of it, whispered in the dark, became a secret prayer. One night, tragedy struck. Inés attempted escape through an unused service passage beneath the western courtyard discovered by chance. Clara helped her, risking everything. They made it as far as the docks before guards surrounded them. Inés was captured, but by some miracle, Clara slipped unnoticed into the cargo bay of a brigantine bound for Malta. For 6 days she hid among barrels, surviving on rainwater and grain. The sailors discovered her when the ship was almost safe under the Maltese flag. She collapsed at their feet, her body too weak to stand, her voice unable to utter her name. When European officials recorded her testimony months later, she spoke in broken words, half Arabic, half English, tangled beyond repair. She tried to describe the years of servitude, the markets, the beatings, the nights inside those perfumed prisons. Reporters wrote that she stared blankly when asked her age. Her mind lingered somewhere between two worlds, no longer enslaved, yet never free. Historians would later claim that such accounts were rare, isolated exaggerations. But documents from the 17th century, preserved in archives from Spain to Denmark, confirm them again and again. Over 1 million Europeans, men, women, and children, were taken by Barbary corsairs between 1530 and 1780. Of those, the majority vanished forever into lives of forced labor and sexual bondage. The women's stories in particular were buried deliberately by Europe itself. To recall them was to confront humiliation, impotence, and guilt. Clara's fate after Malta remains uncertain. Some sources claim she entered a convent in Naples and lived out her days in silence. Others suggest she returned to England only to find her family gone, her village erased from the map. No one knows for sure, but her story, whether myth or memory, represents the countless voices silenced by an empire of slavery that Europe conveniently forgot. History has many glorious chapters, of exploration, of invention, of triumph, but also those stained by cruelty too deep to forget. The Barbary slave trade was one such wound. For centuries it bled unseen, its victims turned to shadows along the thresholds of two continents. Yet their suffering left fingerprints on both sides of the sea, in the watchtowers still standing on Mediterranean coasts, in the old prayers whispered for the lost ones, in songs sailors once sang about the black galleys of Algiers. And now, centuries later, the duty falls on us. To remember, to speak, to confront the past not with pride but with truth. The story of what the Barbary pirates did to captured European women isn't entertainment. It's a warning carved in history's bones. It reminds us that civilization is fragile, that silence allows cruelty to thrive, and that the stories we bury are often those we most need to hear. If you've stayed with this story, don't let it vanish again. Share it. Keep their memory alive. Subscribe to this channel and join us as we continue to unearth the hidden chapters of history, those forgotten voices that demand to be heard. Because understanding the past isn't about glorifying what we were, it's about ensuring we never become that again. Remember Clara, remember them all, and never allow their stories to be lost to silence once more.